Hi, my name is Jesse Durham, and today's subject is going to be all about our cars. We've had them, we have them, we'll probably end up having more. On that note, we're going to see just how vehicles play a very practical and pragmatic example on how to become our own bankers, as described in R. Nelson Nash's book, Becoming Your Own Banker, how to apply the infinite banking concept. And with vehicles, it's a great place to start or to add to what it is that we are already doing. So, vehicles. Let's start by asking ourselves, how many have we had? It's just a good thing to think about for a second. Are we on our first, or are we on our fifth, or are we on our 10th? How many do we currently have right now? How many will we have? Do you normally get one every year, every 10 years? Whatever the case may be, the following question should be, how much of the money that we've spent on the vehicles we've had do we currently have today? Now, if you're not applying the infinite banking concept, the answer, of course, is going to be like I said several years ago, and it's none. The money spent, it's gone. You know, we have the vehicles, or maybe not, but the money's gone. Well, we want to identify a couple of things, define a couple of things before we move on to the different ways to finance a vehicle. And let's start with recognizing that there could be an argument made perhaps about whether a vehicle is an asset or a liability. If we did arrive at assets being income producing items, cash flowing items, then we could readily ascertain that a vehicle is a liability. But not only is it a liability, it is a depreciating liability, meaning that its value is going to be going down over time. So not only does it not provide an income or a cash flow, but it depreciates over time. Now that's just the nature of vehicles. I have vehicles, you have vehicles. There's nothing wrong with having vehicles. But for sure, I believe we'll outline that there's a superior way to finance the vehicles in our lives and in our families. And let's begin by looking at those different manners. Okay, we could traditionally finance a vehicle where that is with a third-party lender, a commercial bank. We could finance a vehicle over 5 years, let's say, for a certain percentage of interest, and we could drive it, not own it today, but we could drive it over those years while paying that car payment. And as long as that car payment is not hurting us out of our budget, we don't normally think about the interest that's being paid to others and the terms that we've agreed to that were not set by us and many other different factors. But we're going to look at that now. But we could traditionally finance a vehicle. We could also lease a vehicle. Now, a very cursory statement that I would make is that let's always remember in any of these circumstances that the consumer pays for everything. That's just the nature of business, any business. The consumer pays for whatever it is that they are consuming. So if we are considering leasing for an option, and you make up your own decision, your choice. But if we are leasing a vehicle, we can presume, and Nash does a great job talking about this in his book, but we could presume that the person that owns the car, that is leasing the car to us, is not planning or anticipating to lose money in that business. So again, I understand if you're good with the terms, fantastic. But let's remember that it is the consumer that pays for everything. And then, of course, we could save up cash and pay cash for a vehicle to avoid paying interest to someone else. So all my cash is king, folks. More power to you. I can appreciate that. And it's a better option. It's not the best option, but it is a better option because then we're not losing interest that would otherwise have gone to somebody else. But for sure, there is another option that's going to be using the infinite banking concept. So again, in financing a vehicle, we're using someone else's principal, someone else's capital. Okay. or rather we're building that capital for them. And not only that, which capitalizes an entity that they own, okay, their dealership or their commercial bank or their third-party lending entity. We're funding and providing capital and principal for their entity that they own. And not only that, but they've charged us an interest to be able to give us that vehicle for our use. So we're paying principal, we're paying interest. The terms have been dictated by the third-party lender, and those could be, several. It's not just the interest rate, but, what does it look like if you want to make early payments, or just many, many different things. But regardless, the point would be that we are not dictating those terms either. So normally, as long as the consumer is okay and they're not hurting to make whatever the monthly payment is set at, I mean, do we necessarily care how long we're paying it? And do we really pay attention to how much interest? I know I didn't. Before discovering the infinite banking concept, I know that I didn't. So some lessons we learn the hard way. In leasing, we're assuming all of the risk. I mean, we're capitalizing someone else's system. We're paying interest above and beyond because that's their business. They're going to be earning. They're going to be profiting. And I'm not disparaging profits. I'm not disparaging business, but I am here to promote the idea that I can be my own banker. You can be your own banker. We can become our own banker. So we're going to look at vehicles. So I'm not disparaging business or profits. I believe in being profitable. If you're not going to be in business very long. And yet let's recognize our role that we choose to play, especially when we abdicate certain opportunities, such as setting terms and losing interest that otherwise could be coming into our family, and principal. It makes me think of Warren Buffett's rule number 1, never lose money. Number 2, remember rule number 1, or don't forget rule number 1. Okay, and then paying cash. Well, to pay cash for a vehicle, we set some aside, or we set some aside, or we set some aside, or we get a chunk of money. For some, it's going to be a tax refund or some such similar circumstance where a lump sum of money comes in and we go out and consume something. A vehicle would be a great example. Again, we could be talking about anything else, but we're going to talk about a vehicle right here. And what happens there is, sure, it's a better scenario because we're not then paying interest to someone else. And yet, when those dollars leave our hand, they are never to return. So we are capitalizing someone else's system. Even if we're not paying interest into that system, we're still capitalizing someone else's profitable business, profitable entity or system instead of our own. And again, I believe that if we can do two things with the same dollar, that's a win-win scenario. Two birds with one stone kind of scenario. So if we could build up an asset and then also leverage that asset to procure, in this instance, a vehicle, we've accomplished a couple of things. So paying cash, it's a better scenario. I'm going to promote the idea that it's not the best. So let's keep walking that out and lay these two scenarios before we dive in on any numbers and just a 30,000 foot above look at day one. So day one, whether a vehicle is leased or financed or we just paid cash money for it, day one, we have a vehicle in our possession for our use. The terms and conditions are going to look different in those scenarios, and yet I'm still going to bundle those and contrast with the infinite banking concept approach, because from day one, there's not an asset on this side where we've looked at traditional financing, leasing, paying cash. There's not an asset over here. In all these scenarios, we have the vehicle parked out in the driveway. But in the event that we go and we buy, or we at least use a policy that we already have, but let's just say it's even a brand new policy. Someone that's looking or vetting this idea and maybe even considering, well, where would I start? I'm not here to tell you what to do with your money, but I'll throw out some ideas. If you were to purchase a whole life policy with a mutual company that pays a dividend and then leverage the cash values in that policy, access the capital in that cash value of the policy to buy a vehicle, from day one, you have In stark contrast to the depreciating liability that's parked out in the driveway, you now also own an appreciating asset. A whole life policy that's been properly structured for the banking purpose with a mutual company that also has a dividend is an asset. There is guaranteed growth, and I'm not speaking on the dividend at that particular point. There is guaranteed growth in that whole life policy. And then, of course, there is that very, very respectable anticipation of receiving a dividend on top of that guaranteed growth. But let's not even focus on that, because day one, we have a death benefit also. So sure, we had the cash value immediately in the policy that we were able to access, and it had guaranteed growth from there on out until our graduation or the policy's maturation. But also there is a death benefit to that policy. So day one, if I had a worst case scenario, let's say, and you had an early graduation or I have an early graduation, we immediately are going to have a tax-free transfer of wealth that should be in great excess of whatever the value of this particular vehicle is, obviously. So we have an asset that we own, that we've controlled. We've accessed the capital in that policy to be able to make a consumer purchase. And yet we have an asset intrinsically tied to that purchase that we've made. So again, two birds with one stone. We bought an asset and bought the car that we were going to buy anyway. Whereas in the other three scenarios, we've assumed a whole lot more risk. We've conceded to someone else's terms. We've abdicated the banking function. We're capitalizing and even paying interest to someone else's entity, or forfeiting the interest that we could have otherwise earned on our money, such as through a whole life policy that we own and control by paying cash. So there's a stark contrast from day one, where we have this appreciating asset of a whole life policy and the car. Now, we could dive deeper in on the details of when we make our policy loan, how we pay that back, what kind of terms we give ourselves. And I'm going to be pretty favorable with myself when I'm the banker, because I can. Now, I'm not saying to steal the peas, don't steal the peas. And if you don't know that reference, read R. Nelson Nash's book, Becoming Your Own Banker, the grocery store. But as the banker, I can provide whatever favorable terms I want. I could pay some back, all of it back, slow, fast, big, small. I get to dictate all of those terms, okay? So I don't want to jump right to any numbers and gloss over the fact of we can be the ones controlling the banking function for the vehicles that we buy throughout our lifetime. And then for our children, for grandchildren, we can just cover that in our financial footprint in our system privately. All right, so in this next section, I'm going to pull up on my screen some numbered examples. And again, much like in Nelson's book, I believe that when we recognize that we can become our own banker, that the details are not going to matter as much. Now, I'm not trying to skip over any details. I don't mind looking at the minutia. But again, the whole concept is becoming your own banker. So when you're the one that is dictating the minutia, that's when it just doesn't matter nearly as much. We're capitalizing an entity that we own and control. We have the access. We're not taking on any additional risk, whereas we would, being a consumer financing cars in a traditional manner. All of the benefits are on our side. All it does is grow our system, grow our privatized banking system by assuming another subject matter, such as financing the vehicles in our life, to what it is that we're already doing. We have all the protection against inflation, against litigation. We have the tax-free death benefit as a transfer of wealth. I mean, there's just so many guaranteed growth. So all these different factors in my opinion, far outweigh what we will see in the numbers, but I understand I'm a very visual person, so we'll dive in on some numbers just to give some practical examples. Remember this, decimals move left or right. So some may be small, some may be large. It's the principle that you can become your own banker that I want us to be able to focus on, but let's take a look. Financing vehicles using the infinite banking concept can both return principal and interest to our own privatized banking system, where we're not taking any additional risk, we're not losing control, we don't even have to change our cash flows, and yet we get to dictate the terms. We are our own banker. So just for an example, let's use a $10,000 vehicle as the amount. And here I understand that it's very easy to get bogged down in interest rates. Again, if we'll understand that we are capitalizing an entity that we own and control, where we benefit from the growth of that entity and being able to have the access and control to that entity, that we will be happy to capitalize that system, paying interest to that system. And I also want us to recognize that it is possible to earn on an appreciating number where the compounding is not interrupted, such as with a properly structured whole life policy with a mutual company that pays a dividend, while paying a greater interest amount to procure something. And in this example, that would be a vehicle. That it's possible to earn more on that appreciating, uninterrupted amount, even while paying a higher interest rate on something that is amortizing. Okay, it's going down systematically. So let's put something out here. Something. Again, let's not focus on the numbers because they can move left or right. They could be big or small, but let's just look at something here. So let's say we're talking about a $10,000 vehicle, 5% interest rate. Could be 4 years, 6 years. Again, let's go with something pretty generic. We'll say 5-year loan, 5-year duration of the loan. No extra payments. We're not gonna calculate that in. But so let's just look at this, okay? So the payment, is that on yearly? It's gonna be in yearly. I apologize. Let's click that over to monthly. Now we're looking at something that's a little more that's a little more common. Okay, the monthly payment, $188.71. So again, that's where most people are going to focus. Sure, everybody wants a good rate, but as long as the payment fits in to a quote-unquote budget, okay, then as long as we're not hurting, we're most times just going to get the car that it is that we're wanting when we traditionally finance something, as long as we're okay with the payment. I've been there, I get it. But if we actually look at this for ourselves through the lens of becoming our own banker, that $188.71 payment is not where I'm going to focus. I'm not even going to want to focus on that next line. Sure, it matters that $1,322.74 is extra money that would forever leave our hands if we were to traditionally finance this vehicle. That is important. It cannot be overlooked, the value of uninterrupted compound growth that will occur in a proper structurally whole life policy with a mutual company. Okay? But where I truly would want us to focus is on that total paid. Okay? Actually on the principal, the capital that made this whole thing happen. See, we used someone else's capital and we had to pay it back. So yes, the interest matters. Yes, the terms matter. Yes, I want to be the one that gets that interest. I want that to come back into my family. I want that to come back into our system. Yes, I want to be able to dictate the terms and the conditions and not be beholden to someone else, not have abdicated the banking function in my life to someone else's red tape and paperwork and scrutiny. Sure. But the principle, remember what Nash said in his book, he who has the gold makes the rules. It's the golden rules. We're beholden to that third-party lender because we've used their money, their capital. Whereas if we were to systematically capitalize an entity that we own and control, these numbers would not be for someone else, but they would be for us. And that's the whole crux of this topic of looking at how we finance vehicles, is how we can become our own banker even in financing vehicles, so that sure, we still end up getting the vehicles that we would otherwise get. I know we're going to get cars. We've had cars. We have cars. We're going to have more cars. We're going to do that. That's going to happen whether we pay cash for that, whether we traditionally finance, whether we lease, whether we get stimulus money from the government and just blow it on a depreciating liability. And I'm not here to disparage anybody for doing it. You do what you want with your money, but I am here to educate and promote the idea that if we could do two things with the same dollars, we're literally accomplishing more than if we don't. Okay, the value of the ownership and the control of a whole life policy, along with getting the cars that we're going to get anyway, is just the best scenario. Paying cash, that's better, than traditionally financing or leasing. But getting the cars and the money back, that is the essence of becoming your own banker. So when we flip it and we see these numbers as that payment, if that payment is us repaying the principal, the capital back to the cash values of our policy, plus interest, okay, because we pay ourselves first, then we pay ourselves with interest, but then we recapture that money. That second item, the total interest, the $1,300 plus, that's what grows and scales our own privatized banking system. If we did borrow this money from someone else, we would have to pay them back interest. They're going to be profitable, so why wouldn't we hold ourselves to the same standard? So when we pay that interest back, that goes back into our system and not someone else's. So the total comes to our capital being amassed, warehoused back in the policy that we own and control. Also interest, just like we would have paid to someone else, is now also in our policy, ready to deploy for whatever next task we have in line for it to accomplish. But also, we were the ones that dictated these numbers. See, myself as the banker, and I like to go with bigger numbers for myself. And when I see that interest rate is coming back into my banking system, bigger is better in that regard. Because next time I want it to be a bigger car, maybe a better car, or the next car, it may be a business venture. Again, we could insert anything here other than just financing vehicles for personal use. This could be business equipment. This could be college. This could be a honeymoon. This could be vacations. This could be, it's the infinite banking concept. So you can insert whatever you want for the infinite part. But when we see these numbers, and this is why I didn't focus on the numbers, but when we do see these numbers, when we see these principles playing out, what does it look like when you started with $10,000 in cash value in your policy, let's say, or at least you access $10,000 worth. But then the next go round, you've got that $11,322.74 there ready to go. And that's not considering the dividends from that policy. That's not considering the value of you being the one setting the conditions for accessing and then also repaying your policy, having the advantage of the appreciating asset of the policy itself that's demonstrated through the death benefit, which is a beautiful tax-free transfer of wealth. That's a beautiful contingency to offset, procuring a consumer item such as a vehicle, and just many other things that we could discuss. The value of becoming your own banker puts all these numbers to us. These then become our numbers and not someone else's for their entity or their system or their terms. So I hope that this subject matter has been helpful to you. I understand that in having bought vehicles in my lifetime, cash money, traditionally financing, and then now coming from the perspective of being my own banker, having a system of policies that I own and control, I look at purchasing and using vehicles very, very differently now. And of course, even anticipating what we will have in place for our children. We have 3 children, my wife and I, and it will look very different for them when they come to that age than it did for my wife and I. So it's been an exciting subject for me to cover. I hope that it's been helpful to you. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments about this video, I'd love to be able to hear from you in the comment section. Of course, if you'd like to have a personal conversation about how you could apply the infinite banking concept in your life, be it with vehicles or anything else that we cover on this channel or that's important to you, don't hesitate to reach out. You can contact me at 828-817-4223 or email durhamtalents@gmail.com. I look forward to our next conversation. Have a great day. Take care. Note to self: I will not be heard with the mute button on. Okay, from the top.